right. So I'm Marc from Switzerland. And today I'll be talking about the Cynefin model and spiral dynamics, and especially around organizational context. And just a couple words about myself. I guess I fall under the category of organizational consultant. I work in organizational transformation. I think it's more the coloring of what I do that I find interesting than the words in which to categorize it, and the methods employed. So I work a lot with ValueMatch and the diagnosis tools to help start any sort of movement in transformation in organizations. So spiral dynamics is a big fundamental framework that I use in my work. And yeah, I've been introduced to this model, the Cynefin model, a couple of years ago, and somehow I felt like they needed to be kind of put on top of one another and kind of see what comes out. And so this is the experiment that came out that I'm going to present today. And I work with an organization called Paradigm 21. And yeah, we train and we work with organization in transformation, mainly in Switzerland. I think that's enough for the introduction, and we'll get straight into the content of it. So I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction of the global context that we're in. VUCA is not a new thing, so I'm not going to explain it or spell it out, the acronym, what it means. I think we've all heard it a dozen times. The thing we take from it that it opens up is really that there is a new paradigm to organization for whom now the capacity to adapt to the constant changing environment that they find themselves in is becoming sort of the main criteria for their own success and their own survival. So it's mainly this sort of complexity of the environment in which they find themselves that I'll take in consideration. And so what we notice is that organizations are beginning to evolve towards models that are more agile, more distributed, more self-organized. And this is what we see as sort of the macro context connected to VUCA. But equally interesting is the shift in the needs of individuals, that they are no longer satisfied from simply just doing their job and having hobbies. They are increasingly interested in being active and involved in whether it's in their projects at work or even with the organizations itself. They also come more and more with a need for autonomy and independence. And that's also constantly increasing. People today seek to have free will, and they now, whenever it comes a question about committing to something, people come with all sorts of demands to the table. So they really feel like they want to be in control of their lives. And finally, there is this sort of need for purpose and to identify sort of with what values or what are the important causes that are becoming, that I'm attached to, that are important for me. Initially, or a lot of articles talk about this quest or this seek for values and limit it to the newer generations, the Generation Y or Generation Z, as a quest for purpose. But I fundamentally believe that it touches every generation, and it takes sometimes only scratching a little bit under the surface and to find that it's becoming harder and harder to find individuals, regardless of their age, who are not in some way or shape looking for purpose in their lives and in their work. So it's really by putting those two forces here, the macro force and the micro needs, kind of together, that we see the pressure under which organizations find themselves. And that's really the center of the screen here. We see these two opposing forces of change, both in the context and in the people that the organizations employ, that those are two pretty strong pressure points. Now, the danger with looking at, I would say, complexity being on the rise kind of everywhere, is the danger is to generalize it. And And to say that now every organization sort of needs to be evolving towards some more, distributed governance model or something like that. And that's where spiral dynamics comes as a useful reminder. And it tells us that without any tensions between our behavior and the environment that we operate in, there's no concrete evolution is actually necessary, nor is it even desirable. There is no such thing as like, we want to evolve along a path because it's cool to evolve along that path. So let's not fall into the trap to see that evolution would be some sort of smooth, natural, and linear line towards a more complex context or something like that. So that's where spiral dynamics sort of helps us kind of get back in touch with reality. It's interesting to observe that the organizational context of complexity is not systematically present in organization, even we are playing in a VUCA environment. On the other hand, what we can notice is that some organizations who don't find themselves yet in a complex external environment, sometimes they bring this own context of complexity into their own organization by choosing to evolve or move away from a mindset where everything is based on a mechanic vision, where human resources are sort of resources. Actually, the real word of resources comes from the mechanic metaphor, from the orange value system. And if organizations choose to put humans at the center of their organization, well, they're actually inviting complexity into it. Even the functioning of a single human being is already kind of quite complex in nature, and that increases if you start putting several human beings and ask them to collaborate with one another and form some kind of organization. So sometimes complexity comes from the external context, which is what VUCA points to, and sometimes it's also induced by this shifting in the life conditions that an organization might choose to adopt. As a mindset, as maybe also as a response to the needs of the people that it has, in the need of the employees. So that was sort of the introduction. So where do we find ourselves in? And now let's look at this model called the Cynefin framework. It was developed by a Welshman, David Snowden, in 1999. So this is not at all a new model. The word means habitat in Welsh. And the principle that it brings is that any situation or any problem that we are dealing with belongs to one of these four categories: obvious, complicated, complex, or chaotic. The dark space that's sort of at the center represents disorder. It's not exactly a context, but we'll get to that at the end. So this Cynefin model is not a usual 2x2 matrix. It's a model. I think there's someone that needs to mute themselves. So it's a model that the boundaries are a bit blurred. So it's kind of an emergent model. And that's why the lines that are delimiting the different contexts here are actually not straight lines. This is really on purpose, is to show the fact that it's more an emergent model that's trying to make sense of the existing dimensions, trying to categorize what already is there. The model distinguishes between a predictable nature, which is on the right side, so the obvious and complicated on the right side of the model, and an unpredictable nature on the left side of the model. It has been designed as sort of a problem-solving tool to help assess the situation by first understanding which one of the contexts are we in before choosing what kind of response is the most appropriate. So it's really actually geared more towards management and leadership than it is at all geared towards organizational development. But we're just going to see if we can add a couple layers of organization information on top of that model. But what we're first going to do is kind of start looking into what it builds. But let's first start a bit with the question of what's the connection between this model and organizational development. We'll see, the first thing we'll do in a minute is to look at the cause and effect relationship, especially what the difference is between the predictable context, where you can just research a problem and predict the effect of a solution, versus on the left side of the model, the unpredictable context. And where actually the same techniques that we use to do in the predictable context, which is sort of trying to predict what our action is going to be, turns out that that's kind of becomes counterproductive. And just a simple example now that I gave illustrates actually how organizational change is usually dealt with by organization. Because most of the time, people think that organizational change or organizational transformation, or at least the implementation of it, is something of a complicated nature, which would be something you can kind of study and replicate a model and somehow apply it, and it will work. And if you have enough experts working on it, eventually you can get it to work. When, in fact, organizational change is really complex and often even messy in nature, which would fall into the chaotic context at the bottom. So for sure, organizational transformation itself as a phenomenon falls more on the unpredictable side of the model here than on the predictable side. Let's start now with this question of cause and effect. That's a really interesting way to start exploring these four contexts. So in the obvious context, cause and effects are here labeled with C and E. So problems are usually perceived as obvious, and they have usually a very direct, clear, and repeatable cause and effect relationship. So that's, you know, the predictability of cause and effect is particularly strong. If we want to make an analogy with games, the game of tic-tac-toe would be the best analogy. Tic-tac-toe is this sort of thing we put an X and an O in a little grid. And in this game, a few simple rules are actually enough to just play the best possible game. And, you know, the best way to start is to put your first piece in a corner. That's like sort of have that, and you're already kind of ahead of the game. So that's an analogy of the games, and we'll keep that going as we go into the next context. As we move now to the complicated context, the cause and effect relationship is no longer obvious in nature, which was the case for the obvious context, and it requires now much finer analysis. And that's in organization often conducted by experts who are trying to determine all the relationships between the multiple causes and what we are observing as effects. So predictability can still exist, but it's now becoming a domain of experts who use their predictive models. And if we want to go back to the game comparison, chess would be a good example of this context, because it involves considering several possible options of, you know, if I do this, my opponent might do this or this or this, or if I do that, he might do this or this or this or that. And considering all those options, and from there trying to reduce the unpredictability of what my actions are going to produce. Now, as we move to the complex context, problems are often in a completely different nature than the problems of the complicated context. And the main difference is that the cause and effect relationship, while it still does exist in the complex context, it is only really revealed in retrospect. So you can't predict it, but you can always find out afterwards. And to go back to the game metaphor, here, the perfect example is poker. So that's not like chess where, you know, you're doing the predictability thing. Poker is really a game that requires really careful observation and experimentation. So if you're in a context of complexity, you cannot learn with knowledge or bringing experts to the table how to best solve a problem. You need some kind of action, some kind of probing to start testing to see what responses you're getting back. That's the main difference with complicated. Now, as we move to the chaotic context, chaos really occurs when there's no observable relationship, even after the fact, between cause and effect. And the other thing that we notice is whatever relationship we might be observing, they're constantly changing. There's no point in investigating or analyzing. And if we want to stick here with the game analogy, here the best analogy is the children's game, in which the rules are constantly changing as you play along the game. So you can't even predict what the rules that you're playing with. Now that we've established sort of this cause and effect relationship in those four contexts, let's look at different practices that emerge in those different contexts. So in the obvious context, after looking at all the possible options and calculating the best path, we usually respond to obvious problems by choosing the best possible practices. So what's emerging in the obvious context is best practices. Now, instead of going to the game analogy, we're going to do a little bit of a COVID analogy here. So, for example, washing your hands during a viral outbreak is the best practice to avoid contamination. And that's pretty obvious because we know the cause and effect between washing your hands and contamination. If we go into the complicated domain, sorry, I'm missing an E here, it says good practice. There's no longer a best practice in this context, but there's a series of, after you do a series of analysis, it's possible to start determining either a good practice or good practices based on what you've observed in the past from all your experiment. So sort of back to the chess game, that would mean, for example, assigning values to all the different pieces that you have and the pieces that your opponent has, and start measuring the total of your pieces and see if it's greater than the total of your opponent's. That would be a good practice that would emerge as something you could do, a set of practices that would emerge as things you could do in chess in this domain. Let's go back to COVID. So in the COVID-19, the recommendation of the health authorities at the beginning of the crisis were perfect examples of such things. Banning gatherings, closing schools and businesses, confining peoples at risk. So this is a series of good practices, that, we already kind of know they work from different things and so fairly still predictable, even though with some chances of not exactly getting it right. But there's a fair amount of predictability that experts can come up and say, if we do all these things, most likely things are going to get somewhat under control. Now, moving into the complex context, we're interested in investigating now the results that our actions have produced. And for that, we need some sort of sensing. We need to sense how to adapt our practices to, and then experiment again. And so the resulting practices that come or that emerge in complex environments or contexts are actually emergent in nature. An example in the COVID times, doing a progressive release of all the sanitary restrictions was a good example of sort of a step-by-step approach, since no model could actually predict the impact of releasing a lockdown on, what are the risks that this could trigger a new wave of contamination right away. We didn't know, so we kind of went step by step, try a little bit of release a little bit of that and see what it does, release a little bit here, see what it does, etc. So this is this constant probing and testing, and basically the practices are emerging. You don't know ahead of time what's a good practice and how to do that. So that's unpredictable, again, by nature. So you can start to see that there's probing involved in sensing in there. And now if we look into the chaotic context, since the rules and the context are constantly changing, a chaotic context, well, invites actions and testing of new practices without having any sort of indication whether they will work or not on whatever it is what we're trying to do. But we do something, there's no other way to progress but actually doing something, even though you don't know that what you're doing is actually going to contribute to the situation. So in COVID, government executives who took power at the very beginning of the crisis, they decided to act as quickly as possible, with the main objective for the leaders was to do a bunch of stuff and hope that some of it might contribute to stabilize the situation a bit. So that kind of gives a bit of color of like, yeah, it's easy to criticize after the fact, but if we bring back the context in which those decisions were made, and we understand that there was no predictability and that there's no connection possible between cause and effect, no matter how many experts you bring to the table, then you realize that there isn't really much of another choice than to just start doing a bunch of stuff and see what happens. So that gives us now two angles, cause and effect, and the kind of practices that emerge. Now, if we look at the kind of strategy or how things actually work in those contexts, strategy for solving problems or looking at organizational models and see how different they are in the different contexts. So in the obvious context, with the tic-tac-toe analogy, for example, observing involves really just looking at the grid that you're playing. And then we kind of categorize the different ways to reduce the possible combination into smaller and more manageable subsets. So there's a whole lot of categorizing. So, and categorizing is really the central element here of the strategy in obvious context. And you do that categorizing usually before a response, before you respond to the situation. So it's like, it's choosing essentially what to do, categorizing. If this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. If we look at the kind of organizations, this context, this obvious context, is predestined for a centralized type of organization. Because it is possible for one person or a small group of persons to have a complete overview of everything that is happening inside, both inside the organization and outside in the whole landscape and environment that the organization is operating in. So centralized organizations do quite well in obvious contexts. Now, if we look at complicated context, where, before it was enough to categorize the obvious things, it's now a matter of analyzing. So the big change here is in analyzing, and that's the centerpiece of the complicated context. This is when expert advice come into play. This is when we develop models to interpret our observations, and then, we recommend actions so we can influence the course of events. So for organizations that evolve in this complicated context, it is necessary to develop different centers of expertise, because you're going to need different kinds of experts. And so because you're going to need different kinds of experts, you're going to naturally have different sorts of teams. And therefore, creating or operating in a centralized structures won't work anymore. That will reach the limit of this context of there's a centralized structure that we saw in the obvious context here is not going to work anymore. So it requires a form of decentralization, a form of delegating competencies to the different experts, and then at some point bring them all together so, the situation can be analyzed and we can determine what to do. So the decentralized type of organization is what is most commonly observed in complicated contexts. Now, if we look at complex context, analysis is no longer sufficient to solve a complex problem. Analysis, actually, you can see, is not there anymore. Now it's necessary to start probing, and probing requires or implies at least a form of action. If we go back, this is the context in which the poker game came earlier. So investigation or probing can take the form of a bet, and that will force your opponent to respond, and they can respond either by folding or by outbidding you. And this allows you to kind of sense what their reaction is. You can also start observing body language, but it's important that the interpretation of even the body language does not involve analysis of those observations. It's a more subtle part that involves feeling or sensing. So it's more than just a rational bringing it into an Excel table so we can then make the right decision. It's something much more subtle. That's where we bring probe, sense, and respond. So for an organization that evolves in a complex context, and the complex context, let's remind ourselves, that's the C in VUCA. What we see is that the distributed type of organization is the most appropriate. And distributed really brings the principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is to bring a decision the closer to the action, the more distributed way. And this allows this cycle of investigate or probe, sense, and respond to be carried out as close as possible to the field, as close as possible to where action is happening, and as far away as possible from any sort of centralized power, and therefore away from the centralized or decentralized structure. So when an organization faces a complex context, moving to a distributed authority and using collective intelligence model is kind of the only way that to guarantee that it can stay agile and still be relevant in all the different domains in which it plays. Now let's go to the chaotic situation. In a chaotic situation, acting is the first necessary step. In the analogy of the children game where the rules change all the time, there's no point in trying to analyze anything, analyze the rules or trying to investigate anything. The first thing to do is to participate in the game with the others, and then, kind of sense the impact on others, and then eventually start adjusting how you act based on the response that you're getting. So because action is the very first step of any strategy in a chaotic environment, the centralized type of organization, again, is best suited to do that, because decisions about how to act can be made quickly, and it can be made quickly by one or few people. And it doesn't matter whether the action taken is correct or not, but it does matter how quickly you act, and the capacity to sense then the impact that that action has, so that you can then respond to that again. So at the very beginning, when I introduced you to Cynefin model, I showed you the right and left side with the predictable and unpredictable side. And some of you might wonder, well, what about the top down? Is there sort of like, what's the characteristic of the upper two context, the lower two context, which is kind of what our understanding of models usually happen. And the Cynefin model itself doesn't bring one. For me, it only started to emerge when I started bringing this kind of what kind of organizational structure work in which of the context, that it became clear that what shows up here is that the commonality here is that the two lower contexts, obvious and chaotic, seem to be suitable for a centralized structure. They both do best with a centralized structure, while the other two contexts higher up clearly don't. The ones on the uppers tend to distribute or decentralize things, where at the bottom we would tend naturally to centralize things. So this is not a characteristic of the model. This is an observation based of my attempt to fit different type of organizational models onto the model. And in both cases at the bottom, between the obvious and the chaotic, it's most effective to not have too much discussion and debate before acting. In the obvious context, it's true because it would be useless to add complication to a situation that is obvious. And in the chaotic context, it's true because it would be time consuming and hindering the action that needs to be taken, because action is the first way of dealing with a chaotic context. Okay, so that is sort of like the first three parts where really the cause and effect, the practices, and the order in which we deal are part of the model. And already when I start plopping these centralized, decentralized, and distributed type of organization, that's already sort of putting something on it that wasn't part of the original Cynefin model. And now we're going to go even further. Now we're going to start plopping spiral dynamics, organizational models on top of it, and see what works and where and why and how. So let's start at the bottom, the obvious and centralized structure context. In this domain, I identified three types of structures and value system that can function in an obvious organizational context. But there's always one, or at least in this case, there's one that really, observably really fits the most. And this is the informal structure of the purple value system that comes with a patriarchal type of leadership. And the absence of complication and not having any complex elements in the environment make this type of organization very functional. And that's because the person managing these structures, they often have the experience and they have the skills to make all the decisions that can be made or need to be made centrally. And also a cultural trait of a purple structures is that the leaders are trusted because they carry on certain traditions of how things are done in a given field. And in this context, decisions are any decision that the leaders would take, they would be perceived as fair and they would be respected by their employees because they have the capacity to do that, and they most likely have the experience and the tradition, and they know about the best practices. So purple is the one that fits the most here. Another one that fits but a little less is the autocratic structure of the red value system. So it's a strong leader that has all the answers and is followed by people. Very similar kind of to the informal structure from purple. Because the future is predictable, a strong leader with sufficient intelligence or experience can actually produce achievements that give him or her an almost kind of guru status that people can trust and follow. And that is connected with the nature of the obvious context in which they operate. Another one is the centralized and hierarchical structure of the blue value system. When the environment and the external elements are predictable, it's relatively easy for a person to exert the power that is given to them by the hierarchy and produce reliable results using the controlled structure of bureaucracy. So bureaucracy can work quite well in this environment. The culture that would develop is that there is a right way and a wrong way of doing things. And it would then, of course, be expected that everybody gets in line and follows the rule of the right way, which is the way it's done here. And there's no room for debating that, whether it's appropriate, whether it's effective or efficient and all of that. It just becomes kind of the right way to do things. So that's for the obvious context. If we now move into the complicated context, let's start with, there's two types here of structures that do quite well in a complicated context. The first one is the bureaucratic structure of the blue value system. And this was really the first, if we look at the history, the first really large organizations before globalization started, before the 80s, there were either religious organizations or government organizations or NGOs, or some sort of large industrial companies that were usually kind of national organizations. They could be private or semi-private consortiums and things like that. And all of them were typically structured in a pyramidal model, which is a way of scaling what has worked so far, a centralized structure from the obvious context. So if you think about what a decentralized structure is nothing but a sum of centralized units kind of networked together and put together interconnect them vertically was a top-down delegation of power. So it's a repetition of what already worked in the obvious context, but scaling in size makes that impossible, and therefore the need emerges to have decentralized structure. And this type of organization can work fine in complicated contexts if there is no need for innovation and if there isn't much competition, which is, for example, typically the case for religious organizations and governments and NGO, and most of them still operate with the blue or from a mainly blue organizational structure. So these bureaucratic structure can fail in this context when there is a competitive environment and when there's a need for innovation. And that's combined with maybe the need for growing profits or constantly sort of optimizing processes to gain more efficiency. And in this context, the result-driven organizations, result-oriented organizations do much better. And that's from the orange value system. So they keep the hierarchy, they remain hierarchical, but they're more flexible, and they typically structure themselves either in the shape of a matrix, so that all the experts have their own separate teams and things like that, or they creating more agile organization, usually by creating a parallel organization constituted of project teams. Most profit-oriented organizations today function in this value system and are constantly pushing the boundaries of competition, performance, and all of that. And the entire world of management as we know it today derives from this world. And that's the mechanistic approach that this view has, where humans are basically a resource. And this turns out is actually the weakest part of those organizations. And the way to measure that is by looking at the growing psychosocial issues like burnouts and bore-outs and brownouts, and quiet quitting is another term that we hear quite a lot these days. Those are the visible symptoms of systems in which humans are under constant pressure to produce more. And it's not like they don't know it. So even those orange organizations, they start integrating elements from the green value system primarily into an orange environment, which creates kind of a dissonance on its own, but this is really the attempt. Most human resources department in orange organization are actually quite green. And they also understand that creating communication around green values starting to look good. It looks really good for their employment branding and things like that. So there starts to be sort of this mix of orange and green that's starting to emerge. You know, whether that's functional or not is another question. And that led me to invent a new type of organizational context that kind of almost a bit of as a joke, but is appearing more and more. And I call them the green-skinned orange. So I don't know if you know that fruit, but there is apparently a fruit that is an orange that has green skin on the outside. So it looks like an orange fruit, but if you start opening up, it's actually purely orange inside. And so this, what I talked about before, orange organizations starting to put the first layer of green paint on how they operate, it is almost starting to make a move towards this category. But on the other end of this category, we see organizations that are typically, that actually really strongly communicate green values. And some of the examples that Lalou cites, for example, are Ben & Jerry or Southwest Airlines and Virgin and things like that. So those are organizations who put values, culture, and people before profit, and they're fairly vocal about it. This is one of the components of green organization, but these organizations don't necessarily have egalitarian structures where decisions are made by consensus. So instead, they still typically have a hierarchy, and they still have managers, and these managers tend to be more people managers, which kind of comes back again from bringing green values into it, enabling people rather than exerting some sort of authority. Typically, they use participative management, where management maybe makes the decision after an advice process with the team. Yeah, the culture in these of these organizations are shifting, but their structure usually remains a classic pyramid. So you can see culture shifting, but structurally they remain a pyramid. A lot of organizations that I work with as customers, their culture has shifted way into the green, while their structure actually sometimes looks more like a blue or blue/orange or orange organization. And that's a source of tension. So these organizations, these kind of green oranges, are not contributing to solving complicated context better. They're not solving the complicated context better than any of the other two. They're not doing better than the blue and or the orange at solving, you know, the complicated context. But they certainly alleviate the most undesirable effect of the previous two, which is the dehumanization of employees. So that's for the complicated context. Now let's move into the complex and distributed. So let's start to see which ones of the value systems, and we'll see two, that try to work in this context, although with many limitations, and mainly they're not really the right fit. But let's see what we observe first. And the first thing that we have to observe here is that organization in the orange value system, they really want to operate in complex organization. And they want to distribute authority and call on collective intelligence. And they do that by creating their matrix organization and allowing people to be grouped sort of together in cross-functional teams, so they can exchange best practices within those teams, and they create project teams and all of that. So that's an attempt of orange structure, developing agility to the point of hoping that it will help them solve or function or operate well in a complex context. Yet complexity requires a form of action in order to be probing the system and to be in the sort of investigation phase, and then be able to feel what the environment response will be. And this is rationalized in the orange environment by a culture of innovation in which trial and error is celebrated, or pivoting to a new strategy, like, you know, the lean startup model, where you pivot all the time and you keep experimenting, and the learning by doing. So they bring in those cultural traits in this sort of attempt to do this action and sensing what's coming back. But the pitfall in using this approach is that there's usually a lack of understanding of what sensing really is, because in the orange mindset, it's analysis that's at the center of it all. And that's the default mode of perceiving what the response to a complicated system is. In the complicated system, we use analysis, but we do analysis in the complex world, it doesn't quite work. So that's really the pitfall. The competitive mindset, the calculated behavior, the winner culture, the matrix or project-based organizational structure of the orange value system systematically show their limit in a complex context, and they're not particularly appropriate. Yet the orange value system remains dominant in for-profit organization, even if they're in a complex context. The second one that we see showing up is the green value system. The organization may well include some kind of hierarchical component, or even include elements of a decentralized structure, but it brings really what green really does is, again, bringing this principle of subsidiarity, which becomes for the first time in green organization more important than subordination. So it's subsidiarity over subordination. Subordination is the hierarchical ranking of people. But green brings a more egalitarian system, so it gets rid of subordination and really allows subsidiarity, which is what is needed in this distributed model that we just pointed to before. And so there's two ways of looking at this. So when organizations choose to put humans at the center of an organization, they adopt a more green value system, and they make their organization evolve in a way to be more compatible with individuals' needs. And in this case, this is when organization induce complexity. This is when they bring complexity from just focalizing on humans. And in this context, green works pretty well in the complex environment that is induced by focusing on humans and putting human relationships at the center of it all. However, if the organization is facing complexity from its external environment, the green value system, well, it can also be effective, but only if it's combined with the willingness to experiment and take risk. And those are characteristic of the orange value system. That's what orange brings to the table. Or of course with the same traits that could be integrated from a yellow value system that we could see as healthy orange. But without that, the purely green structure risks to fail because of its shadow aspect, that is, it is really hesitant to act. Green value system require consensus from all before usually being capable to act. And when it comes to sensing and response, again, everyone involved would have to agree on how to interpret the response and on what the best course of action is. So yeah, it might be functional, but this is likely to slow down the learning curve and the capacity to produce results. And if the context is evolving very fast, this pitfall could really provoke the downfall of a structure that is too slow to respond, even if the action that at the end it takes up taking is the correct one, but becomes too late to produce the expected result. So that's really where green could fall short. And finally, the value system, or the kind of organizational structure that we see to be most fit, is the one from the yellow value system, where the organization distributes leadership and authority, and it is structured in a completely distributed manner. So the organization is self-learning in nature. People and teams are autonomous, are self-managed, and this is really the distributed organization. And this seems particularly adapted to face the context of complexity. Another characteristic of this value system is its ability to act without being driven from fear. So the capacity to act first without having fear from what if I make the wrong choice, or the fear of failure and things like that. So basically getting over all the fears and being able to act quickly is also a characteristic of the yellow. Yellow also has a pitfall, and yellow has the danger here to add complexity to the situation. Being in a complex context, yellow would be capable to adding extra complexity to the situation, adding complexity to its communication in such a way that it makes the situation confusing or maybe incomprehensible by others. So yellow has to be mindful of its capacity to add complexity to an already complex environment. And now finally, let's look at the chaotic context. Modern organizations rarely find themselves in a state of extended chaos. But what we see is that the autocratic mode of operation from the red value system is the one that works best. We tend to reject this value system because we associate it with power and force, or even dictatorship. one of the main lessons that we get here from this Cynefin model is that it's useful to reconcile maybe with this mode of functioning, because it's often the last resort of an organization that's going through a chaotic phase. It can even be interesting for a distributed organization in yellow to foresee in its governance principles that when it's facing a crisis or a chaotic phase, that there is a transition to an autocratic mode of functioning. And that's not just something that's tolerated, it's actually something that's desired in that case. Of course, the trap would be to stay in it and hold on to the power, whereas the only goal of this autocratic model here is to get out of the crisis as soon as possible and return to whichever more stable context the organization finds itself in and start functioning from there again. And the other one, there's another value system that should be mentioned as well in this context, and that is the yellow value system, which is tier 2 equivalent of the beige survival value system. Well, beige isn't the organizational context, but it can be argued that in a large scale, survival challenge such that as an organization in chaos or humanity as a whole, what we're facing, the challenges that we're facing as a humanity globally now, that the yellow value systems solutions would be critical for survival. Yellow tends to act from a place of sensing and trust instead of from fear. Which one could argue and point to and say that would be needed to respond to large-scale chaos. However, the yellow is written here in small compared to the red, because the one thing I don't want to do is to imply that yellow is needed to address the life conditions of a chaotic situation. And it doesn't mean that other structures don't work. It's just that I'm pointing here to the red as the most effective one to work in this environment. And last, I want to point now to the center of the Cynefin model, which is disorder. Disorder is not an organizational context. It's more a situation in which an organization can find itself when it's using the strategy that it's used to, but in the wrong context. It finds itself, for example, in a complex context, and it keeps operating as if it was in a complicated context. And this creates tension and dissonance in both functioning of the organization and how people experience the whole the working in that organization. In today's context, it's common for organization to be labeled as problematic or dysfunctional or even toxic. Those are symptoms of the context of disorder. And it means that they're developing strategies and employing models that do not fit the context in which they find themselves. And this is where spiral dynamics comes in really handy, because spiral dynamics has a model for how change occurs. And the disorder context certainly has a role to play in it. Change only occurs when the life conditions evolve. And the question is, are we then capable to perceive that the life conditions have evolved to a point where the actions and the strategies we deploy are no longer coherent with the context in which we are? And the more tension there is, the more disorder there is, one could argue, the more likely it is to see a change, either a first order change or second order change occur as a result of these tensions and the disorder that shows up. And I think I'd like to stop right here. First of all, because I need to blow my nose. And second of all, because I think I've talked enough in a stretch and I'd rather open it up for conversation and see what else there is from you guys.
Good. Thanks very much so far, Mark. I think that was very profound. Questions? or responses, right? So thoughts or questions.
I think I would definitely say thank you so much, because I mean, before any questions, because this was just mind-blowing actually, and was excellently delivered and very clear, and much clearer than when David Snowden actually explains it. Yeah, so thank you for that, and also doing this despite your cold, because I think that's quite severe cold. But I've got questions as well and observations, but thank you.
We might as well go ahead with the questions, I think.
Well, I'm not sure what it's a question. It's for me, it's more of an observation, really. I work with a process called the Wisdom Council process, a dynamic facilitation, and which can be used in organizations, but also in sort of democratic contexts. And I think the thing that I'm seeing is that I think as a society, I think things are highly complex at the moment, at the verge of turning into chaotic. And I think there's a real fear in people that red system will take hold of society again. And the importance at the moment that there is a democratic failure for a yellow system like this Wisdom Council process to really emerge, because people are still trying to deal with that, in a way, the orange system and the blue systems to operate in this complex domain. And yeah, I'm not really sure where I'm going with my thinking, but I think it's given me such an eagle view of what I've been thinking about for quite a while. So yeah.
Yeah. The only way I can reflect to this is to point that second tier is really the way out of this rejection of the red, which is very strong in our current world. We can't really, we don't know how to handle red today. It's this world. That's why it's everywhere in our culture. You know, rap, gangster, you know, red cars, displays of power, it's movies, music, it's everywhere. And somehow it's like it's a sign of revolt, and we don't know how to channel it. And we don't know how to channel it from orange. We don't know how to channel it from green, because most likely it requires some blue to do that. But, you know, the more you evolve along the spiral, the more you tend to reject those as well, at least in first tier. And obviously, looking at this entire model, this entire exercise of the Cynefin model is pointing to a second tier value system. And this is an illustration of how to look at it from a second tier and to actually recognize. But you can only really kind of do that from an emerging yellow, to start to recognize that there is room for a healthy red in getting us out of any chaotic situation. And it might actually look quite different. A healthy red in charge might actually look quite different than the images we have of the toxic reds that we fear so much in first tier.
May I ask something? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
When you have different phases in the for the red in the chaotic phase, you have the cold phase and the warm phase. The cold phase, then it's purple or red, then it's obvious. And the warm phase, then it's the war, the chaotic, and the polarization. And when you can make that difference between cold and warm phase, or you can see it if there is a cold phase for that part, then you can handle it with purple or red. especially red. When there is no cold phase, then it's yellow. When it's chaotic from itself.
Yeah, I mean, I can see for sure that yellow has a contribution to make, either as itself or as a capacity to embody a healthy red in chaotic situation. I would just be hesitant in saying that the yellow is needed in any of those.
Yeah, I compare it with the firemen's and the fireworks. They have a cold phase and a warm phase. The cold phase, and then it's obvious, and then in the warm phase, it's chaotic, and red is the power, the good power to do it. And you can put that on many different, many different organizations or groups of people.
Yeah, thank you for adding that.
There's a question in the comments in the chat, Mark.
Oh, okay. Let me read it. Sorry, I didn't see that. David Snowden talks about a complacency cliff edge between obvious and chaotic, whereby you can sleepwalk from obvious to chaotic. Can you please talk to how you see the linking to spiral? I don't link those, actually. I just want to be clear. I only use that analogy because they share the need for more, or they function better. They're more effective at resolving the problems at hand with a centralized structure. That is what they have in common. I wouldn't say that I necessarily sleepwalk from one to the other. They are quite opposite in nature, yet it turns out that the centralized structure tends to work for both of them for different reasons, though. Is because there is no need to overthink things in either of them. And that's what they have in common. It doesn't mean that they have that many other things in common. Actually, I don't think they do, other than what I just pointed to, and the fact that red is, if you're looking at it through the lens of spiral dynamic. If you're going to wonder where could red find a red structural system, a red organization would be functional, well, it's going to be in either one of these. For sure, red isn't going to be anywhere functional in a complicated and complex environment. So that's another thing that they might share, although red is more appropriate for chaotic than for obvious. And that's about it. I don't see many more things. So maybe your question Andy would need more details if you would like me to go further on this.
Okay, Ignacio. Oh, sorry, Andy, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, it was more that people operating in an obvious kind of environment can fail to see some things that could slip them into a chaotic state. And Stone gives a few examples, but your response is focused particularly about organizational structures. So I appreciate what it is you're saying. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right, and what I'm adding really to the Cynefin model is kind of organizational structure view, which is and the reason why I do this, and I see the benefit, the main benefit of that is for organizations to start to be aware that there isn't one way to develop your organization, and the context in which an organization finds itself, or even the context in which a part of an organization finds itself, will require a different way of thinking, and that's what the Cynefin model brings. But it might also require different kind of organizational structure, different kind of leadership, different kind of decision making to operate in those contexts. And that's really the layer I'm adding from by bringing in spiral dynamics. And I just intend to use the Cynefin model to that end, rather than bringing really spiral dynamics to the Cynefin model. It's more bringing the Cynefin model to spiral dynamics and to organizational change.
Got it. Thank you.
Ignacio, please.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for the presentation. First of all, I've got two questions based on your experience. The first one, have you done any connections between the stages of change and this model? How to interlink one or the other? That would be one question. And the other one would be, in your experience, which are the 2 or 3 critical elements that organizations have to go through as the context moves from complicated to complex? Meaning, my own experience, I see in this VUCA world that I would associate it more in this transition into this complex. So moving from this orange, or as you very nicely mentioned, this orange in the inside and green in the outside, to really the yellow model that's more related to the complex. What have you seen, which the major shifts that have to do in that movement, if any?
So the answer to the first question is, I haven't really looked at the stages of change and applying it to this model. I'll share some articles with you later. Where I do go a little bit deeper into the disorder and first order and second order change. So I go a tiny bit deeper on that, but I don't really bring in the different stages of change. So no on that, but if you have inputs on that, I'd be happy to hear from you, and maybe we can integrate that into those articles, and be happy to hear from your contribution. And the second question is, what is really needed to evolve or shift from a complicated context to a complex context? And I think the simple answer to this is green. Nothing can happen without green. It's interesting to see, and I go a little bit more into in the paper, in the articles, I dig a little bit more into, well, what about green? Because really there is no green. There is no context in which green shines, or it doesn't appear that green shines in any of those contexts. It appears briefly here and there, but it isn't really as its own suited to perform really well at solving one of these contexts. Yet green, in my eyes, plays an absolute critical role. If we're looking at the complex environment, the complex context on the top left as being best handled from yellow, if we take this at the level of organization, or if you take this at the level of the social economic situation that we're in now, at the global problems that we're facing as humanity, if we are to evolve to second tier and start driving those solutions from second tier and coming up with new solutions, then we can't do that without having fully embodied green. And we are today in an orange dominant society, at least in the Western world for sure, and with plenty of regression into blue or red, even in politics. And while green is on the verge, is on the rise in people's lives and how they choose to live their life, maybe outside of work, it hasn't really affected the economy yet. And the economy is a huge power to a certain degree. Our economy and financial interests actually lobby their way through whatever governments decide, and the whole structure is kind of taken over today by the economy, and that's for sure a pure orange. So the only thing that bridges the gap between this and a second tier is green, is going through green. And I don't have the answer of what that looks like, how it should be done, whether the green oranges is the right solution, but for sure it takes at least that path for now. That means today, for a very orange organization, it might not be possible to just shift and become like one of these green organizations. We're not in that context where that is such a cool thing to do quite yet. So the sort of green-skinned orange might be the first step towards it. And there might be better attempts of combining green and orange than we have seen so far. So far, we have seen very poor examples where essentially management knows there's something to do with the people and they bring in some consultant, do some trainings and hope it's going to go well because everybody's going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya for one afternoon. And then everybody's going to, go collaborate happy and perform better the next day. And unfortunately, none of that ever worked and none of that ever will work. So that's when green and orange don't play at all well together. The question is there a way that, green can be brought to orange so that they can start, if not speaking the same language, have an understanding at least of complementarity. But this I might be flirting with something that's outside of spiral dynamics, just looking at reality of what we see in organizations. I see leaders of organization who are profoundly orange, and when they take the survey of ValueMatch of what they would like their culture and the structure of their organization to evolve towards, they point to green and yellow, but they themselves have very little green. So there is some bridge to gap, and there is some gap to bridge. Sorry, it's probably meant to be the other way around. There's a gap that needs to be bridged, and for sure green's going to play a big role in that. Green might not be the solution, but it might be a means to something, and I don't know how and where. But let's not bury green completely yet by pretending that it's not functional, doesn't produce results, and takes forever to decide and all of that. It does bring people together in a new way. It has very powerful way of empowering teams and individuals. And while it might not be the most productive setup, there's something to say about, maybe there's even will be rooms in Orange organization where that will be the new culture somewhere. Even though on the outside it's still producing results. I don't know, something of the sort. I don't know if it lands any coherent answer to that.
Thank you, Mark. Several things make a lot of sense. Willing to look at your papers on the disorder and change and seeing what can be added. And I completely agree with that point that you said that we have orange leaders expecting or actually trying to rule green and yellow organizations, and that's a major challenge, at least from what I see too.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Yeah, Mark, I had a question, comment. I'm not sure. When I look at the way you divide it, it makes a lot of sense to me. And then when I look at the complicated parts, I can also see why you put blue and orange in there. And at the same time, to me, orange is a lot more capable of solving certain complexity than blue is. I worked a number of times with organizations that were like center of gravity blue governmental organizations, and they were privatized, and they had to obviously that is a change in focus. But what you also saw in that is that certain projects, especially when they run across disciplines, orange is so much better at tackling that than blue is. Because blue is task oriented. Orange is result-oriented. I'm just wondering whether you see a link with that, so I'm not saying they shouldn't be there, but or maybe complicated has different levels in it.
It's interesting because you didn't mean to say, but you said that orange handles complexities better than blue.
Yeah, exactly.
Complicated models. It's interesting how like it's.
How do you look at that?
Yeah, I think I tried to explain to mention that, and maybe let's see if it was not clear. For me, blue has its place in the complicated model because it allows scaling of the obvious centralized structure. And that's really its force. Its force is to be able to make something, a small centralized structure to make it scale and connect it all with one another. That's its capacity, but it fails when there's a need for innovation. It fails when there's competition. It fails when the context is evolving rapidly. But it does work really well at scaling. And for sure, the sheer fact of making any organization big makes it complicated, just as the sheer fact of making a human center of an organization makes it complex.
Great, thank you. So we got 5 more minutes if there's any other questions or comments. Anybody? Okay, good. Then I think it's time to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Marc, for your, you want to say a few words about this?
Yep, I just want to leave you with those links. We'll be sending the PDFs of this presentation. So you have 2 links. This is the paper that I wrote. I split it into 2 articles, and I made sure they were published just before this talk, so they're very fresh. If you see any typos, feel free to let me know. They just came out. So 2 articles that pretty much resume the whole thing that I told you today and a bit more. And you're welcome to look at them and reference them in whatever. If you're writing things about things, point back to them or comment on them or improve or suggest things. And I just want to say thank you for showing up and for your listening. If by any chance you need to connect with me, here is my email and my phone number, and you'll be getting that in a PDF file. Okay, are you sending a PDF file, or will I do that, or how do we do it?
We will organize something. Yeah. I have some ideas. We'll discuss that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much, Marc. That was a fantastic presentation, and I love the content. I love the way you present it. So, and also your openness to further develop your own work. So thank you very much for that.